Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to HSBC. My name is Mukhtar Hussain. I'm a Group General Manager at HSBC with responsibilities for the Belt and Road Initiative and Sustainable Finance. I work very closely with Jonathan. It's a very great pleasure for us to host a meeting here today. In particular, let me welcome some very distinguished guests that are here from the IPCC, Professor Zhao and Professor Portner. It's a great honor to have you with us. And indeed, our esteemed guests from the Hong Kong Observatory. Wonderful that you've been able to join us today. We meet at a very interesting juncture of time. I think if we look at history, science and business haven't always been natural bedfellows. But it is true to say that when they have come together, some of the world's greatest innovations and solutions to some of the world's greatest problems have been found. And never has there been a more important time for science and business to cooperate. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning we're here to test a hypothesis, or in fact, to confirm a reality, which is that climate change poses the biggest single threat to our existence. And we need to do somewhat more than to understand the threat. It's now to mobilize the actions. Both science and business have an incredibly important role to play. Science will help us define the problem, understand the issues, accelerate some of the solutions that we need to find to dealing with these challenges. And in the midst of these challenges, business will have to think through how to commercialize, how to industrialize, and how to deliver solutions that are sustainable. Because the capitalist economic system relies on outcome, it relies on incentives, and it relies on people wanting to do the right thing. And I think never has been the case more that institutions like HSBC and many of you that are present in this room would like to see the right outcomes prevail on a more consistent basis. So I think we'll spend a morning today going through some of the challenges, trying to understand some of the opportunities. And to take you further through what the outline of the day is, let me ask my colleague, Jonathan Drew, to take you through the agenda. Jonathan.
Mukhtar, thank you very much. I think for most of you, our distinguished guests from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel itself will need little introduction. Perhaps for those of you who are less familiar with that organization, a reminder: it was created by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme with the specific purpose of undertaking and reviewing research on the topic of climate change. So the organization reviews, assesses, and summarizes that key research. And their timing today, as Mukhtar alluded to, is perfect because they have just released over the past few months 3 very significant reports covering each of what is in store and what we might expect in terms of climate change and the impacts of climate change on land, oceans, and the cryosphere. So that's really setting our agenda for today. So the morning broken into 2 sessions. In the first, we will cover the climate impacts and also very briefly look at possible mitigation pathways, including possible mitigation pathways here in Hong Kong. We will then have a coffee break, and during the coffee break, opportunity obviously for you to start conversations, continue conversations, and we've put on the windows over there some posters of some of the key graphics from those 3 recent reports, and there are some HKUST students in the room who can help guide you through those. So please do make it a very productive coffee session. And then in the second session, we will move on to look at topics such as particularly adaptation, recognizing that some of the impacts of climate change now appear to be inevitable and irreversible, so we need to prepare to adapt. And of course, our success in mitigating will then determine the extent to which we might need to adapt against much more severe impacts. So that is session 2. In both of these sessions, there will be plenty of time for your questions during panel conversations, so please don't be shy. Have your questions ready. Do ask them, because this really is, in my opinion, a unique opportunity for all of us in business to hear from the very best in science that there is on a matter that, as Mukta has just pointed out, is indeed a very critical business issue, risk and opportunity. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to a successful morning. So I'm going to pass, without further ado, to my good friend, Professor Robert Gibson from the Hong Kong UST. We're obviously delighted as HSBC to be co-hosting this with the UST. I'm going to try and embarrass Robert very briefly, because in the spring he rang me and said, Jonathan, we've got the IPCC here in October. Do you think it would be good to get them together with some business people? I don't remember exactly what I said. Robert may do, but it was something like "you bet," or perhaps I referred to whether the Pope really was a Catholic or something inappropriate like that. But clearly, it's absolutely the right thing to do. Thank you to all of the team, who've worked on the administration to make today happen, but particular thanks to Professor Robert, because without you, we wouldn't be here today. Thank you very much for that. And over to you for session 1. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. And you know that any good communications person should not be part of the story. They facilitate it and they're invisible in the background. However, Jonathan, Lynn, please could you stand up? Jonathan is the other person why we are here today. He is the head of communications and media, and he is the person who's very kindly organized the IPCC, very generously spending 2 days here. And yesterday, the Hong Kong Observatory hosted a meeting for academics and for government engineers, talking about this material in more technical detail, and also organized for them to visit the central government offices to be able to talk to some of our policymakers about it. And then finally, these energetic chairs for the IPCC did a long presentation for our students at UST in the evening. So we are very grateful for all they're doing. But now we have 2 20-minute presentations. The first one, Professor Zai, who is based in Beijing and heads up the meteorological work in the mainland China, and is the co-chair of Working Group 1, the working group that looks at the science of climate change. And you have details of his extensive CV here in the program. I will just now ask him to very kindly help us on the issues. Thank you, Dr. Zai.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues, friends. And my presentation will mainly focus on the new understanding of climate change sciences. And you see in this figure, different colors. The gray one, you see a lot of variability there. That's representing the observed global mean surface temperature change. We say 2 degree warming, 1 degree warming, and that's, the figure. So for this curve, the bars representing, because this is a monthly mean, so you see a lot of natural variability there. And the observation covered all over the world, not only on the land, but also on the surface, sea surface, and started from 1860. Because we only have the data since this period have better coverage than this period up to 1990, we call that pre-industrial level. This is a proxy. And because earlier stage, they have very, very limited human activity influences. And the red color standing for all the external forcings, including human activity and the solar radiation changes, and also volcano activity. For such changes, or because of not part of the climate system, because we call that external changes, so driving the change of the temperature. And the yellow one is purely human-induced, mainly by increase of the greenhouse gases, such as increase of carbon dioxide linked to the industrial revolution. And you see the increase up to the present. We have, say up to the present, we say for climate change, mainly we look at least 10 years average, because you have an year-to-year change. So 10 years change or 30 years change more stable. Then up to this period is about 0.9 degrees C increase compared with pre-industrial level. But when you look at very early, say to 2017, 2018, about 1 degree warming already. And so you see mainly the increase of temperature is induced by the human activities. And this is the curve I talked about. That's, we call that global mean surface temperature, including land and the ocean. However, say on the land surface, above, we observe in the screen, a lot of meteorological service, we have observation, well covered on the land area, actually increased much higher than global average. So we talk about, say, about 1 degree warming compared with the pre-industrial level for the whole global average temperature. Then compared with land area, it's much higher. We can say about 2 times, compared with the ocean area. So in land area, we have a special report of 1.5 degrees C, but for the land area already warmer than 1.5 degrees C. And mainly for Paris Agreement of the special report, we talked about global mean temperature, not only for the land, but the land temperature increased much faster than the ocean. And not only increased the mean temperature, but you also see a lot of change with the extreme events, especially on the land surface. You see here, increase of the heat wave, widespread floods, wildfire, and extreme sea level rise, and flash floods and heavy precipitation. And also have some small scale extreme events like tornado, and we have less confidence on this. And only some of the extreme cold extremes like frost, it's decreasing because in warming world, you have less colder extreme event. And you see, for this region, also have, especially linked to the ocean changes. Global mean surface, global mean sea level is rising with acceleration in recent decades. So recent decades, the sea level increased much faster than compared with earlier period due to the increasing rates of ice loss from Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets, as well as continued glacier mass loss and the ocean thermal expansion. Because although ocean temperature increases a little bit slower than land, but most of energy, about more than 90% of the human-induced energy in the climate system is absorbed by the ocean. So ocean is also becoming warmer and cause the thermal expansion and the sea level rise. Also, you see tropical cyclone winds and related winds and rainfall is increasing. And the increase in extreme waves combined with relative sea level rise exacerbate extreme sea level events and coastal hazards. So that's, I think, very related to the region, to the Hong Kong. And what about future? Actually, the future projection, because I already talked in the past century, mainly the change is climate change is induced by the human activity. So the future projection also based on the scenarios, they're based on socio-economic pathways. So one is high scenario, say in IPCC language, you call it RCP 8.5, something like business as usual. Another one is lowest scenario in CMIP 5, but this scenario is a little bit higher than 1.5, something like 1.7, 1.6, which is following Paris Agreement well below 2 degrees C, but not 1.5 yet. So you see for the marine heat wave, if based on the high emission scenario, can increase more than 10 times for the marine heat wave. If based on the lowest emission scenario, also can increase something like 5 times compared with heat wave in the earlier stage. And for the thermal expansion, you see that the heat stored in the ocean also increase very quickly and cause the thermal expansion from 0.1 to 0.3 meters. And also from cryosphere aspect, like Greenland ice sheet and Antarctic ice sheet and the glacier mass loss or increase with the scenario. And for the sea level rise, because that has very significant implication for the people live along the coast or in the island. And you see, because even we stop emission, now they still can cause the sea level rise increase based on a higher emission scenario. So up to 2,300, something like in 300-year period can increase up to more than 3 meters. Based on lowest scenario also can be about 1 meter increase. So that's a global average, not for a region, not for extreme case. And also there are some other changes like decreasing of the pH value, which will cause the ocean more acidic, and the loss of oxygen, and those parts are linked to the permafrost, because permafrost is important for the mountain region, for the high latitude region, influence the infrastructure, and also if large scale thawing, it will cause more carbon greenhouse gas released to the atmosphere, cause more positive impact for the climate system. Say if we can keep temperature, we see, because Paris Agreement clearly set the target for well below 2 degrees C, and at the same time we pursue 1.5 degrees C effort. So what's the difference for only half degree temperature difference? So we look at the, because 2 degree or 1.5 degree warming is, we are referred to the whole global average. When you look at the region, actually there are large difference. Only half a degree in the polar area, you can, that much higher than 1 degree difference. So that means if we can control temperature lower, say even average temperature in the high latitude can be reduce much higher than half a degree, can up to more than 1 degree. And also can reduce, cause a lot of difference for the precipitation, and more for the extreme temperature, especially in the in the land area, high latitude land areas. Half degree difference can make extreme temperature difference more than 2 degrees. So that's say even half a degree can reduce a lot of extreme temperature change. And look at the different warming level influence on the tropical area in the Southeast Asia. Say we can see a different color here. For hot days and nights or heat wave, say if we can keep temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, then you see with high confidence or the increase. But if warmer than 1.5 degrees C, that we have large increase, and over 2 degrees C will cause oppressive and very high confidence will cause the health impact, and also cause here the temperature warmer than 2 degrees will cause persistent livestock heat stress. But if we can control temperature below 1.5 degrees C, although they are still worse than today, but not as much as the high level of warming. For the Southeast Asia, you see flooding related to sea level rise. So for 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, we still have some risk. But if we increase more, then we have higher risks. And over than 2 degrees Celsius, we have substantial increase in risks for the flood. And for the Asian monsoon, also, say if we have a large, in a higher degree of warming, then we'll increase in precipitation intensity. And we'll substantially increase the heavy precipitation event. So that's for Southeast Asia, sea level rise, flooding, heavy precipitation will increase with the global warming level of warming. Then you see, compare with lower level of warming, say 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degree warming, we can reduce some extreme weather, especially for the people where live, and including our region. And by 2100, global mean sea level rise will be around 10 centimeters lower compared with 2 different scenarios. That also, but will continue to rise for several centuries. So limiting warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius would require a steep and a quick emission cut. So finally, I would like to show you the schematic figure here. So here, I already talked about this is human-induced warming. This is observed temperature. You see the warming trend and also have natural variability here. And up to now is about 1 degree Celsius warming. And the rate is going to continue, say, by about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. That means about in 2040, that will reach 1.5 degrees C if we do not take any quick, strict actions. So if we can reduce the emission and keep global carbon emission reach net zero in about 2050, at the same time, we can reduce non-CO2 agent after 2030, then we see there is about sorry, this figure. Yeah, here. There is about 2/3 of opportunity to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Then if we take the faster reduction, say in 2040, we can reach net zero carbon dioxide emission. At the same time, control the non-CO2 emission. then maybe we can have higher opportunity to keep temperature below 1.5 Celsius. If we only take action to reduce the carbon dioxide, reach the net zero emission by 2050, not take action for other non-CO2 radiative forcing factors such as methane, black carbon, and other aerosol, then we only have a 50% of a chance. So that tells us, so when we're talking about, to keep, if we pursue temperature, limit temperature below 1.5 degrees C, not only should take action, immediately to reduce the carbon dioxide, at the same time, we also should take action on other non-CO2 factors. And this is the figure showing if we reach net zero by 2050, and take action earlier, then we can reach, say 1.5 degrees C, have higher possibility. And also, you can limit the cumulative carbon dioxide emission. So that means you will reduce the opportunity for overshoot. So if we higher accumulate, we have higher accumulated net CO2 emission, then we have to take the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and store, say, under the ground, then can keep temperature to below to 1.5 degrees C. So that we have to take other measures like carbon capture and storage. I think Hans is going to talk later on. And this showing if we do not take action for non-CO2 factors, then we'll follow this pathway. So my talk will be here. Thank you for attention.
You want to move?
So, Dr. Tsai, thank you very much indeed for talking about Working Group 1's work on the science. The other thing to mention is, the next thing to mention is, well, what are the impacts? And we are fortunate to have Dr. Hans-Otto Pörtner here, who is co-chair of Working Group 2. He has another very long CV, which we have put into the handout. And I would just like to invite him up here to tell us about it. And I have one spare seat next to me if somebody standing at the back would like to come and use it.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks a lot for the honor and the opportunity to be here today and speak to you about the results of our assessment reports. And there are 3 of them, and this is the first time we are trying to develop an integrative picture with the key messages from all 3 of them. Now, I'm doing this from the point of view of Working Group 2, emphasizing one important aspect, certainly the impacts of climate change, and avoiding the impacts of climate change and their severity should be guiding ambition in mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation meaning the reduction of emissions and keeping climate change within limits. This has already been emphasized in the special report on global warming of 1.5. And the messages from this, and you have, building on what Pranmao has said, we can say since pre-industrial times, human activities have already caused approximately 1 degree of global warming. We are already seeing consequences for people, nature, and livelihoods on all continents and in all oceans. And at current rate, we would reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052. And there is one message that is also important. Past emissions alone do not commit the world to 1.5. If we would stop global emissions today, we would be able to stop global warming. The special report on climate change and land looked into this a little bit more closely with respect to the land sector that is supporting all of us and its uses, and against the background of its very intensive uses already, which are non-sustainable by themselves. So there is a demand, and there needs to be a request to convert this into sustainable land use, and the diverse patterns of land use are just indicated here already by these two completely different colors. Land is a critical resource. We rely on it for food, water, health, and well-being, but it is already under growing human pressure. Climate change is adding to these pressures. And you can see this illustrated in this figure, where actually I'm talking about the drylands that are currently covering 46% of the global land surface and are home to 3 billion people. And what we see here is a growing population. What we also see with the intensity of land use, we see an increase in dryland areas that are annually in drought, and climate change may already contribute to these changes. At the same time, we see a decline in the inland wetland areas. So the total land surface is under human pressure, and this pressure by itself is not good for sustainability and for the maintenance of ecosystem services. We've already heard that warming over land has occurred at a faster rate than the global mean, and the current use of land loss and loss of biodiversity are unprecedented in human history. Climate change adds to these challenges, so this is a double whammy that needs to be considered. Urgent action would buffer the negative impacts from over-exploitation of resources. And restricting warming to well below 2 degrees would greatly reduce the negative impacts of climate change on land. It's as simple and as complicated as that. But some mitigation options would increase competition for land, and I will go into that later, resulting in societal challenges. Now, what are we doing? How are we going about assessing the changes and the challenges? We are doing risk assessment, and we are using a simple color code to bring the complexity of the information that is available into a very simple message. And especially our stakeholders are the climate negotiators at UNFCCC, and they need to understand what's going on. And their measures are simplified. They talk about the change in global mean temperatures, as we all know from the 1.5 versus 2 discussion. And they want to see everything in all regions and sectors be in relation, depicted in relation to this. So we compare undetectable risk white, moderate risk yellow, high risk red, and very high risk purple in terms of this simplified color code. And we work with well-defined transitions, defining the transition phases between those risk levels according to the impacts. There are, with respect to the land sector, 2 sectors emphasized here: the wildfire damage, where already at 1 degree global warming, we have an increase in fire weather season in several places. We have seen that during this year, the last few years already. And then if we go even further, go beyond 2 degrees, there's for some places like the Mediterranean, we can say there's over 50% increase in area burned in those places. And if we go into the very high risk area, then there are over 100 million people additionally exposed to this challenge. Food supply for humans is also an issue. This considers that climate change already affects the productivity of crops, and we already see moderate to high risk. We are close to a transition to high risk levels. This affects many sectors, including economics. If there is less food, there will be an increase in food prices. There will be price spikes that affect individual countries. That is already going on. If we go into higher temperatures, there will be food shocks across regions. And then if we go even higher, there will be sustained food supply disruptions globally, because production, essentially, and that is the start of it all, is collapsing. And then we go to the next special report, the IPCC report on ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, that comes with a general message telling us that the world's ocean and cryosphere have been taking the heat, and that's literally so, from climate change for decades. More than 90% of the heat taken up by the globe has been going into the oceans. And the consequences for nature and humanity are sweeping and severe. This concerns various processes. It starts from the melting of the glaciers in the high mountains. It combines with the melting of the ice sheets in the polar areas. Both of them contribute to sea level rise. The changing seawater, changing freshwater supply is coming from the melting glaciers. And then the oceans connect all of these impacts. And then there are additional direct impacts of climate change on the oceans, causing marine heat waves, periods of extreme temperatures, just like we have heat waves on land. There is an increase in sea level. There is a reduction in Arctic sea ice, which has implications, may have implications for global climate. And there are physical chemical changes in the ocean, like the heat content is increasing, ocean pH is decreasing because the ocean is also mopping up CO2 from the atmosphere, reducing climate change there at the expense of ocean acidification. And then oxygen is declining because of increased acidification. So our life-sustaining units, and this concerns 80% of the Earth's surface, our life-sustaining systems are responding. They're changing from the top of the mountains to the depths of the oceans, and these changes will continue for generations to come. We are looking at the impacts of these changes, and you see the physical changes summarized here for different areas across the world's oceans. And you see in all of these places there are changes of these parameters, and they are having impacts. For impacts, we don't have a complete picture for all systems here, and the ecosystems affected are indicated here on the left-hand side. But there is this overarching impression of a reddish color. And this reddish color means the impact is negative. So there is a trend for negative impacts. For some places we don't really have enough information that from the observation, and maybe there hasn't been any changes in the respective systems yet, but there in many places we already see the human business, if you so wish, activities building on those changes or building on those services being affected negatively as well. And this concerns virtually all regions. Now there's one ecosystem that is especially sensitive, and these are the warm water coral reefs. And what you see here is a healthy reef on the left-hand side, very colorful, rich in biodiversity, and the fish stocks of such a healthy reef are important for small-scale artisanal fisheries. When it gets too warm, you see a change in color. And this change in color to white is called bleaching. And what it is representing is that these corals, these animals, lose their power plants, which are unicellular algae living in those animals. And these algae take the energy from sunlight and provide the animal with organic food. If these power plants leave the animal, it's starving. It can do that for a certain period of time, but if it takes too long, it's dying, and the system turns into something like this. It's completely different, overgrown by algae, and low in biodiversity, and low in fish stocks. If we do the risk assessment for that system, it's not looking good at all. We are already in a high-risk area, have been recently. Such bleaching events have been coming back and back and back at large scale, repeatedly already, and 1.5 versus 2, so the Paris Agreement temperatures take us into a very high risk space for that system. Other systems are less sensitive, like the mangroves. Moderate risk starts for them at 1.5, but then the dependent human activities, and especially dependent on warm water corals systems, they also move into and starting to move into a high risk area here. The projections take that into account. We can actually say, even in a 1.5 degree warmer world, there's a high risk of losing 70 to 90% of spatial cover by coral reefs and their services to humankind, be it coastal protection, be it fisheries. And there will be even higher losses at 2 degrees. And you see, even from high up, that's the picture behind this, from space, you can see these large bleached areas in the world's coral reefs. Luckily, the good news is that this is, at the moment, the only system where we know that is really hardly hit already by climate change. Other systems are affected as well, but not to the extent, and you see the risk thresholds, the turning of red is happening beyond the 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature range. This goes across various marine ecosystems, from kelp forests to abyssal plains, helping us to say, yes, Paris Agreement has made a good move. The decisions made with respect to global mean temperatures keep many of these systems in a functional state and their ecosystem services for humankind as well. And this can be said with relatively high confidence. So for each of those transitions, we are evaluating the confidence levels. Let's move to sea level rise. Sea level rise, we see and we can compare what's happening between the recent past and the future. And if you do that in a schematic way, it becomes very clear what's happening. We have mean sea level rise, which may not mean such a lot. But if it combines with storm surges in places such as Hong Kong, this can mean that the sea level rise will be rising very high during extreme events, and the intensity of extreme events is also increasing. Under recent conditions, we may have had a one-in-a-century extreme event with respect to sea level, which, with rising sea level plus the extreme event on top, may turn then into a one-in-a-year event, so becoming more regular and challenging adaptation capacity. And the way this is happening, this is actually already observed to some extent. The dark dots here, especially in the lower latitudes, and your area is also included, the coast of Japan is also included, is already indicating that sometime earlier during this century, with the moderate sea level rise that we've already seen, we get an increase in frequency of extreme events. And this will be even higher under extreme emission scenarios with the higher sea level projected. We can do risk assessment for these places that are being exposed to these sea levels and to what extent they are able to handle this. So we can talk, and we are comparing here prominent places like resource-rich coastal cities, large tropical agricultural deltas, Arctic communities, urban atoll islands. And what you see here is a comparison of the risk development without or with moderate adaptation, just as present activities maybe, and then compared to a situation where we go into ambitious adaptation in order to reduce risk to a maximum extent. This will be very successful for resource-rich coastal cities like Hong Kong, and the adaptation measures will be costly, yes, but it's affordable, and the resources are there. Think about building hard seawalls as a protection measure. But it's not looking as good for tropical agricultural deltas. We see high risk level even developing with ambitious adaptation, even more so for Arctic communities, think of the Aleutian Islands, and for urban atoll islands especially. And there's an element coming in here. The red is representing the adaptation measures with people staying in place. But then if we look at the light green area here, it's indicating that people have to move. So there's relocation happening. This is considering relocation in a region, because this is a sensitive issue. It has been a sensitive issue in the negotiations with governments. We are not considering the need for international relocation, which may actually also be on the horizon for some of these places. So risk development may not be fully stopped by adaptation. And this means that by adaptation, we are not eliminating the risk, but we are buying time until the risk threshold reaches a critical level, and the degree of how this is buying time is indicated here. And it's a very obvious conclusion to say, yes, if we go from the high emission scenario to the low emission scenario and still doing ambitious adaptation, the amount of time we can buy is maximum compared to other situations. Now let's go a little further, look at other sectors. We have talked about warm water corals and their dependent small-scale, low-latitude fisheries. We should also indicate Arctic regions are under threat. We've heard that Arctic temperatures are rising much more than the global mean, with the respective impact on those systems, including the loss of sea ice. Coastal flooding risks are developing progressively over time, and it can't really be quantified for any temperature yet because we don't have a full understanding of the system. All present sea level projections may well be conservative if we are surpassing tipping points of the melting of the Antarctic and Arctic ice sheet. And then there's one aspect I would like to emphasize, that is the direct impact of temperatures on human physiology. Humans in extreme heat combined with high humidity are not able to survive long term. So we are losing not only habitat for species, but we are also losing habitat for humans. Overall, there is less loss and damage at 1.5. Let's look back at a comparison of 1.5 and 2 and look at biodiversity. And on these comparison here, the dark green areas indicate all of those places where actually 1.5 would be beneficial over 2 degrees for the conservation of biodiversity. So there is a good news here. If we are do ambitious mitigation, we can conserve biodiversity. And it would be similar in the marine realm, although we don't have the data for 1.5. What we see here is that already in a 2-degree world, the grayish areas indicate where we are losing biodiversity, also reflecting the loss of coral reefs, and especially the coral triangle and the places north between Australia and Asia are being affected. If we go into 4 degrees, we will be essentially clearing the low latitudes from biodiversity. These are developments over time which can only be compared with situations during mass extinction events in Earth's history. And already biologists are talking about humans pushing the planet into the 6th mass extinction event due to a combination of many human influences. So there is something to be considered here. There's also a redistribution happening of marine resources. Fisheries are moving, animal biomass is moving, the lower latitudes are becoming less prominent in terms of representation depending on the climate scenario, and this also has implications for fisheries catch potential. There's a lot of fisheries productivity at the lower latitudes, and there is some gain in the high latitudes towards the Arctic, at least transiently, because that is where the fish stocks are moving. All animals, including yourself, you're trying to be and stay at the temperatures that you prefer. If it becomes unpleasant, you move. So we can say changes in the ocean cause shifts in fish populations. This has reduced the global catch potential. In the future, some regions will see further decreases, but there may be increases in others, although some of this may be transient. Communities that depend highly on seafood may face risks to nutritional health and food security. And then we move into the management space. We can do something about it here by reducing other pressures, such as pollution, or we do proper fisheries management and set up marine protected areas to maintain ocean productivity. But all of this will work only if we also go into ambitious climate mitigation. So where do we want to go? We can summarize at 1.5 and even more so at 2 degrees, there is disproportionately high risk for Arctic, dryland regions, small island developing states, and least developed countries. Even so, there is a comparative difference between 1.5 and 2. Lower risks for health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth at 1.5 versus 2. So there is an economic benefit of staying at 1.5. And a wide range of adaptation options can reduce climate risks. There are less adaptation needs and a better exploitation of adaptation capacities at 1.5. At 1.5 compared to 2, we will have smaller reductions in crop yield. We already talked about that. We have less population exposed to water stress, up to 50% less. And we will have less population exposed to climate-related risk, including poverty. So again, an economic dimension susceptible to being susceptible to poverty has something to do with the degree of climate change. And there is a lower impact on biodiversity and species. So in the following and after coffee break, I will continue to talk about this on emission pathways and system transitions consistent with global warming, but that just to come up with these strong messages. If we want to keep to the Paris Agreement and to 1.5, CO2 emissions fall by about 45% by 2030 globally from 2010 levels. There are several countries that haven't done much since 2010 and that will feel challenged by this statement. To limit warming to 1.5, CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero around 2050 compared to 2075 for 2 degrees. And we've heard from Pam Mao already, reducing non-CO2 emissions would have to be part of this and would have direct and immediate health benefits. This brings us to a comparison of the respective scenarios. And the respective scenarios include one important aspect. We need to go into negative emissions beyond 2050 anyway, depending on the amount of CO2 that we have pushed into the atmosphere. Depending on how ambitious we are with immediate emissions reduction, this quantity is increasing. Some of this is taken up by forests and agriculture, and some of it may need to be complemented by the use of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. And the less ambitious we are, the more we need this process. Storing carbon dioxide underground will be important, but there are trade-offs. If we need a surface area, like in this case, 2 times India, we will run into problems with food security. So early entry is important for emissions reduction. And what is also important is to consider to avoid an overshoot. So reaching 1.5 by 2100 should not mean to run into warming of 2 degrees and then go back, because the impacts will develop over decades and will be similarly strong and high and severe as if we would be staying at 2 degrees then. And with that, thank you for your attention so far. This is to be continued after coffee break, talking about solution options and governance. Thank you.
Dr. Purtner, Dr. Purtner, thank you very much. Now, there is a third working group of the IPCC which does mitigation, and we are very lucky to have 2 co-chairs. We can't have the third one from the mitigation, but I am just going to talk very briefly about the topic. And the Council for Sustainable Development here in Hong Kong has recently completed getting input from us on what should Hong Kong do in terms of reducing its carbon emissions. And, sorry, do I have slides working? Right. Well, I'm pointing us in the wrong direction or something. Can we move the slides on?
Which slides in the...
So I have 4 slides. No, carry on. Sorry. On the one which I gave this morning, the one that had the landing, there were 4 slides for me to talk about. Yes, here we are. This is very good. Right. So here, if we take Hong Kong as an example, we currently have a 41 megaton carbon footprint. It's a bit over 6 tons per capita. Much of it is our energy industries, the carbon which we emit in order to have electricity and to have gas distributed around Hong Kong. So the engagement says for 2050, should we be 60% reduction, 80% reduction, or should we go to net zero? And you've heard the strong argument that for the globe as a whole, it would be a good idea to go to net zero. So let's think about how would we get there. So for electricity, renewable energy. Let's have as much solar and wind as we sensibly can have in Hong Kong. Let's also import renewable energy from mainland China, where there is actually better areas with better solar insulation and better wind. Let's think about nuclear. Back in 2010, the Hong Kong government proposed that we get a second Daya Bay type arrangement. So we go up to from 25% of Hong Kong's electricity from nuclear to 50%. That would be a big step in moving towards net zero. And finally, for gas, we are going very much towards using gas for generating electricity. That reduces, that's less emissions than coal, but it's still 0.4 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour emitted to the atmosphere. So you then talk about what the IPCC is saying with carbon capture and storage, to collect that CO2 and pump it under the South China Sea. About 100 kilometers offshore from here, there are big saline aquifers where the CO2 could go. But it will cost money to do that. In addition to thinking about these sources of low carbon electricity, there is the big question of how do you balance the grid. If all your electricity came from nuclear, where you basically run it full steam all the time, and renewables where it happens when the sun shines and the wind blows, how do you balance our demand for electricity with the supply? So we need much more storage. Already, CLP has a pump storage across the border, which helps with balancing supply and demand relating to the nuclear. Maybe there can be more of that. Another possibility is hydrogen. The idea that when we have surplus electricity, it is used to generate hydrogen, and when we have a shortage, we burn the hydrogen to generate the electricity to make up the shortage. That's a carbon neutral way of going. And demand management. I have some friends who live in Los Angeles, and they get money back from their power company in return for the power company putting a switch on their air conditioner. When there is a shortage of electricity, their air conditioner is switched off. So it's a really hot day, and everybody's using air conditioners. Their one gets switched off, and they get extra money back for doing that. Maybe we can have some demand management here. Town gas. How do we get our distributed gas to be carbon neutral? One option is that we electrify everything. You do your cooking on electric, even if you are somebody who's very keen on Chinese cooking with a wok. Or another option is hydrogen. Town gas is already 50% hydrogen. It could have hydrogen as the only fuel content, together with some inert gases. So there are different ways of going there. Other countries in the world are looking at how to make that transition. And energy efficiency in buildings. One thing is to reduce the carbon intensity of our electricity. The other one is to use less. So we've been in this room with Nick Stern a year and a bit back, and we say that it's single glazed. If it was double glazed, then HSBC would not need to use so much electricity. So if we move on to the next slide. What about transport? 18% of our emissions relate to transport. And there's a mantra here for transport: avoid, shift, improve. Avoid journeys. If all the children in Hong Kong walked to school, we would have less carbon emissions from transport. If we had a tax system which allowed greater mobility for flat owners, then if you move from Hung Far Chun to, say, the airport to work, why not sell one flat and buy another? At the moment, if you do that, you pay a lot of stamp duty. So we think about how we can avoid journeys, shift from carbon-intensive taxis or private cars towards buses and towards the mass transit. And then the hydrogen fuel cell. Electric may be good for cars, but if you want to make a waste vehicle, a refuse collection vehicle, or a cement lorry, if you want to make that zero carbon, it's payload limited. So if you put heavy batteries on it, every kilogram of battery is a kilogram less of cement carried, whereas the hydrogen is a much lighter way of doing it. And other countries, particularly Japan, are looking at these options. Prioritize taxis and minibuses. A taxi does perhaps 20 times as much time on the road as a private car. So if you get one taxi to be net zero emissions, that's as good as getting perhaps 20 cars. Control the number of private cars. One of the reasons why our buses burn so much fuel is because of traffic congestion, because of private cars. If we had fewer private cars, our buses would be much more efficient. And a link to that is electronic road pricing. When I first came to Hong Kong, I remember Hatton Cave saying, Hong Kong needs two things, and this was before the MTR. It needs the MTR and it needs electronic road pricing. We've got the MTR, but we still haven't got electronic road pricing. And lifestyle. We need to understand the impacts of our lifestyle. We then need to have target reductions, and we then need to educate people so we move towards it. Because whilst our carbon footprint, as measured from our direct emissions, is not very high by world standards, and our government puts up projections which say, look, we're much better than Singapore. Well, part of the reason we're much better than Singapore is that the petrol and the diesel we use here are manufactured by refineries in Singapore, so the emissions are counted for Singapore, not for us. Yeah? We need to think about the impact of the emissions. You know, if the world's going to carbon neutral, net zero, then what about our food? What about the other things we import? And we need to think about how can we reduce those and set some targets. Now, as I say, we do not have the IPCC Working Group 3 chair, so we're not going to have a discussion and Q&A relating to mitigation, but instead I would like to invite our two speakers, plus the director of the Hong Kong Observatory, Mr. C.M. Shum, to join me, and we have about 20 minutes to discuss. Thank you. To come and sit. Maybe I will go at the end, I think. And Mr. C.M. Shum, would you like to go first? So I would like to ask Mr. C.M. Shum to do a couple of things. Firstly, to give a little bit of Hong Kong's perspective on what we have heard in terms of the climate science. But also, if you have some questions for our good visitors, I would be very grateful if you could ask the first questions.
Thank you. So as all of you would have experienced in the past couple of years especially, we had been visited by two super typhoons. And so naturally, up on top of my agenda, we need to do much better in terms of protecting Hong Kong from future storms. So that's as we heard this morning from the two speakers, they both emphasize on the future sea level rise. And not just to the end of this century, because we will have continued effects of the emissions. So I'm really concerned about the presentation that the sea level rise will not stop by the end of this century, but will continue to something like more than 3 meters in another 200 years. And also, based on the latest findings from the IPCC, the sea level rise estimates, the projections, has been even increased by about 10 centimeters or 14% compared with the last assessment. So which means that, I have a very rough idea for you, is that by the end of this century, based on the old assessment, we will have almost every year a typhoon Hatos storm surge in 2017. You remember Macau, but Hong Kong a little bit less affected. But with the latest assessment, 10 centimeters more by the end of this century, we will see Mangkhut almost every year by the end of this century. So that I hope to put into context where we are and where we're going, if we don't curb the current emissions and continue on the business as usual high emission scenario, that would be the picture by the end of this century. So my first question maybe to ask the two experts is that could you elaborate on this aspect? Because I think, of course, heat stress is another thing that we need to take care, obviously, because of the health impact. But for the sea level rise, what would you advise us as a coastal city here in the South China? What should we do?
You want to start?
So it's, I think Hong Kong has more, you have, I know you have good scientists here. One from my friend, very famous study on tropical cyclone. And actually, same in my talk, more focus on global sea level rise due to the global warming and say it's increasing of the mean sea level rise. And at the same time, the extreme sea level rise increase much more than the mean sea level rise. But for the region, Southeast Asia region, and the region for Hong Kong, much more than global average. So I think that's also in that region, not only influenced by increase of global warming and the regional difference, but also impacted by tropical cyclone, as Dr. Chen mentioned. So put them together. I think for Hong Kong, we have to take, consider I think at least, to prepare for this, to more study, localized study, because for this region, for IPCC, mainly focus on the global changes, less on local or regional one. And we try to do that, but a specific case like in Hong Kong, I think IPCC report couldn't cover that perspective. I think Hong Kong scientists can do more research on this and to assess the risk facing for the future. I think for climate change, can help us for planning, because that takes longer time, to change in the future. We should prepare for that, and for the say adaptation. I think most important for the emission, we have to do together with all the people in the world, because that's caused by all of the human being. But for this specific region, I think adaptation is very, very important.
Just to add to this, I mean, you certainly need a good early warning system in place, and there is one precondition to be met, is that your coastal defenses are able to handle the projected increase in sea level rise. And we have not certainly been able to assess this for the region, but in general terms said that your policymakers and practitioners need to have the right awareness for the level of risk. If they are very concerned about the risk, they should always orient what they put in place according to the highest projections. And if they, there will be areas where you open, where you can open the area for flooding, and other places where you have to really keep the water out. So these kind of balances need to be developed. But what we cannot take away at the moment is the uncertainty about the projections. And if you ask me, the next IPCC assessment report may actually come up with even higher projections. So there's nothing graved in stone here. And we need to be flexible over time.
Yeah.
Thank you. So can I have a show of hands for who would like to ask a question? One there. We'll go straight ahead to that question. And the second one here. Okay.
Good morning. I would have a question to pose to Ms. Dr. Partner. I have no background of earth science. We always heard about that the majority of our warming is caused by human activities, and sooner or later, the Mother Earth will take up the self-enforcing cycle, take up the global warming, take up the further warming by itself. So may I ask whether my understanding is correct, or is there any mechanisms the Earth will help to recover itself by cooling it down, even without any further human activities to stop our carbon emission? Thank you.
Thank you. And if we can take the second question, so we have two questions together.
Thank you. Our per capita emissions, as you pointed out, Mr. Robert, is 6.6 on production basis. And as you said, if you're talking about net zero, then does it make any sense to not include our consumption emissions, which are by some estimate close to 30 tons per person in Hong Kong? So are we chasing a 6.6 ton reduction and putting a lot of effort and money into that and not addressing the elephant in the room, which is our 24 tons consumption emissions, if we have to be part of a net zero for the globe? Does it even make sense to spend all those resources? Thank you.
So if you'd like to answer to the extent you wish to on the first question particularly.
On the first question, there's certainly some inertia in the Earth system in how it's responding to emissions, but it's very clear that it's within short period of time. If we would cut back, like go from the present level of emissions to zero, we could stop global warming. We would not reach global mean temperature of 1.5. But what is decisive is the CO2 level in the atmosphere. That is a driving force for the global warming. And when you think about technologies, you have to consider what you want to do with the CO2. And this moves again a little bit into the mitigation space. Can you reuse the CO2 in terms of, for example, using it for methane production as part of the synthetic gas mixture that Robert was talking about, to build it into longer chain hydrocarbons as synthetic fuels for air traffic and ship traffic. So the CO2 in the air that we have, there's currently no process in hand where we can say we can set it by technological means, but we could move into a first step would be to move into an economy that does CO2 recycling rather than putting more and more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. So that should be our key parameter that we focus on, and that at the moment what we can only do is cut down emissions as much as possible to reduce the increase and reduce the degree of global warming.
For the second question, do either of you, or shall I just talk quickly?
Please go ahead.
So to say, the expertise we have here is on the science and the impacts. Certainly, if the world is going to net zero, something's got to happen about all those emissions that are created, for instance, producing beef that we import. And we should be thinking about that, because we are going to have to change as a result of those changes elsewhere in the world. So it is very important. We should understand it. I personally think we should set targets for reducing our consumption of carbon-intensive items, and then think about policies that can move us towards that. But that is not a topic which we have the right expertise in the room today. Any more questions? One at the back. Anybody else? One at the back, and the second one here.
Hi. I'm not sure the sources from which I got the information, but I've heard that even if we stop all emissions almost immediately, a very catastrophic level of global warming is inevitable. And the other kind of question is about nuclear, that I've heard also that the carbon emission in the entire supply chain is very high, even though the production through nuclear doesn't produce emissions. Can you clarify these two comments, please? Thank you.
Can I try to...
We take the second question and then...
Thank you. Edwin now from the Green Earth. My worry actually is that it seems to me that our government has very low kind of awareness in the climate change risk. And lately, the chief executive of Hong Kong SAR government announced the policy address. And I can't hear any mention of, policies or setting targets that to make Hong Kong carbon neutral by certain day. And many countries set the target by 2050 needs to be carbon neutral. That is a big worry in my mind that even our government supposed to be leader in our city to lead us to drive down our carbon emissions and bring us to a safe level. We didn't hear that, and lately the government has done 3-month public engagement exercise about long-term decarbonization strategy for Hong Kong. And in the document, it also didn't set a clear target that we should drive our city towards carbon zero by 2050 or even earlier. And can you give some advice to our SAR government? Thank you.
Say, I try to answer your first question about if we can we can reduce the emission immediately. Well, can we avoid the dangerous level? I think from climate change perspective, there is a so-called commitment change. What does it mean? Something like even you stop emission, but still continue to warm. But the level of warming, level of warming is not very high, say about less than 0.2 degrees Celsius globally. So in Hans' slide, he talked about something like, say, past emissions does not commit to 1.5 degrees C, the warming world. So that means we still have space, to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees C. Say if we cut emission, say we can reach net zero immediately, then temperature may continue to warm a little bit, but not over 1.5, say something 1.1 or 1.2 in that level. But when you over a threshold, say 2 degrees C, then because of positive feedback in the system, like all the glacier, snow is going to melt, then cause more warming, and the more snow, glacier warming, and then cause why it causes the higher, sea level rise, just because of the ice sheet from Greenland, from Antarctic, cannot keep all this if we reach a too high level. But I think if we take emission, take action very quickly, why say quick, deep reduction? Because quick, then say each year, if you still, we for the whole world, we release carbon dioxide, we can, topping this, then but you still add the cumulative emission in the system, because carbon dioxide, they will remain in the atmosphere about 100 years. We call that long-lived greenhouse gases. Then, if we want to keep temperature down, you have to remove this, then to store underground. When you reach several degrees, if over 1.5 degrees C, you still want to have 1.5 degrees C. You have to remove the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. So I think that is the physics, behind. Thank you.
Just to add to this with an emphasis and having a look at the oceans that are very useful for us to buffer climate change. They will continue to take up CO2 when we cut emissions down to zero. They are not in equilibrium with respect to the CO2 content in the atmosphere, and the physical solution of the CO2 takes time. At the same time, the heat content of the ocean is not in equilibrium with atmospheric temperatures. So there will be continued buffering activity of the ocean that will help to then limit the degree of global warming. But then there are other processes that are equally kind of irreversible built into the system, and that is the melting of the ice sheets and of the glaciers. They are not yet in equilibrium with atmospheric temperature either. They are lagging behind, so we will certainly get continuation of sea level rise, even if we cut emissions very severely.
Thank you. The nuclear question, I'm afraid we're not in a position to answer that one today, but by all means write into us and maybe we can find someone who can answer it for you. In terms of this whole business of where we need to go, by 2050, the recommendation is that the world, our humanity needs to be at net zero. If Hong Kong is not at net zero by then, maybe we have to pay somebody else to suck our net emissions out of the atmosphere. Today, we spend money on buying oil from Saudi Arabia. Maybe in 50 years' time, we are sending them money to have concentrated solar power, doing carbon dioxide removal, sucking it out of the atmosphere and putting it down in those holes where the oil came from. Do you have any more comment to make? Because we are nearly out.
Well, at least in the context of climate adaptation, the government, under the Steering Committee on Climate Change, we are taking forward a number of studies to evaluate the impacts of stronger typhoons, especially direct hits of super typhoons in Hong Kong, the implication on the storm surge, on the waves, and also on the high winds. So rest assured that in about a year or so, we will see some results out of that and to guide us for the future adaptation measures.
Thank you. Now, we are, I think, stop now because there is going to be a longer question and answer session with our three good panelists at the end of the second session of this. So now we are going to break for coffee. I would just like to mention that we would like to acknowledge three supporting organizations, Civic Exchange, and the bit that I presented was from some studies that Civic Exchange was doing, the Business Environment Council, which is very good at connecting us to people in industry, and the Hong Kong's Green Finance Association, because if one looks at how can Hong Kong help on this problem and be significant in a global point of view, or certainly regional, the finance bit is a really important area. So for that, we break for coffee and we will resume at, what time should it be? Sorry. 10:50. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to session 2. We heard in the first session this morning what I thought was an excellent summary, just covering where are we in terms of climate change and what is happening. We heard also of the key impacts that climate change has already had and is expected to have on each of land, oceans and cryosphere. We heard some of how that will play out in Hong Kong and some of what it might mean if Hong Kong indeed is to play its part in contributing to moving to this target of net zero by 2050 or however much risk you like to take in the system. In our second session, we're going to allow Professor Ortner just to continue and complete his presentation around areas such as adaptation, but also talk about the critical area of governance and some of the things that might need to be done if we are indeed to see success in this challenge. And then also joining us to present on the Hong Kong perspective on climate change from the Hong Kong Observatory, we have Mr. P.W. Chan. So without further ado, Professor Ortner, the microphone is yours again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. To essentially continue my presentation, I will move into the human sector more and in terms of where we see the challenges in implementation. And this is important, but let me start with, again, emphasizing that we not only need to consider impacts of climate change, but if we take measures, these may have their own impacts. So impacts of adaptation and mitigation measures should be considered, the trade-offs in those choices. And certainly when considering those trade-offs, it comes back once again, that the best way forward would be to cut back on emissions strongly, because we expect co-benefits for human health and adaptation. That follows logically from what I've said before the coffee break. We will have reduced competition for land, for example, in terms of less need for the use of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. We will have benefits for food security for humankind. We can exploit the capacity of ecosystems more to help us with carbon storage and biodiversity conservation. So ecosystem restoration should be a big part of our planning, and we should certainly, keeping all of these benefits in mind, also move into other management strategies in addition to considering climate change, and that is eliminating the non-sustainable use of land, moving into land degradation, neutrality as it is called. For example, and this depends on the integration of multiple responses across local, regional and national scales, considering multiple sectors including agriculture, pasture, forest and water. So climate change strategies do not stand alone. They have to be combined with other management strategies, and here it's so-called sustainable land management, which should also focus on the restoration and rehabilitation of degraded land. We have lost some land already for human food production. This will then also help to eradicate poverty and ensure food security, as well as contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. So sustainable land management is a core issue, and better land and ocean management will actually maintain the natural resources that we have available to us. Combined with ambitious mitigation, this would support biodiversity conservation and would support food security for humankind. We cannot see any of these aspects in isolation. They are interdependent. And one key result from the 1.5 report was actually to emphasize that ambitious climate mitigation and keeping global warming to 1.5 would facilitate reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have all these great tools and great targets put in place during recent years, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the Paris Agreement. The targets are there, but we are challenged by the implementation. And this is a major hurdle that needs to be overcome. We need to keep in mind certainly the synergies between mitigation and adaptation technologies with respect to each of those targets. I cannot go into detail for that. But let's talk about the implementations and where are the societal challenges that we need to consider. Currently, we certainly have, on a global scale, the issue that people with the highest exposure and vulnerability are often those with the lowest capacity to respond and to adapt. They need to be helped. The temporal scales of climate change impacts and their societal consequences operate on time horizons, and that is another key challenge, which are longer than those of governance arrangements. So governance arrangements, and you can turn that around, find it difficult to consider these long-term perspectives. And the planning cycles, public and corporate decision-making cycles, and financial instruments are not usually developed with things and considering things that are at the horizon. Governance arrangements For example, in this case, marine protected areas, spatial plans, and water management systems are too fragmented across administrative boundaries. We need cooperation across sectors and elements, and we need integrated responses to fully take the complexity of the challenges into account. And when we said this and phrased this for polar and ocean reasons, that the capacity of governance systems is actually to respond to climate change has strengthened, yes, in response to awareness, but it's not yet sufficiently rapid or robust to adequately address the scale of increasing projected risks. I think this can be generalized beyond ocean and cryosphere, and probably is true for the land sector and for cities as well. So finding solutions is the important issue. And just to remind you, there's climate change, there's biodiversity conservation, there's sustainable land management, and sustainable ocean management needed. These 4 pillars need to be considered. What can we do? On both land and oceans, we can build networks of protected areas to reduce the loss of biodiversity which is kicking in. Just to remind you, we're talking about entering the 6th mass extinction event on the planet. And enable future ecosystem-based adaptation options, facilitating the poleward movement of species, because climate change is happening, the movement is happening, and there will be new populations and ecosystems set up in different places. The planet is changing. Marine habitat restoration needs to happen, marine and terrestrial habitat restoration, we can pretty much say. And ecosystem management tools such as assisted species relocation and coral gardening can be locally effective. But there is, and this may be a little bit illusionary, there is to be considered that these options may be ineffective if global warming exceeds 1.5, just because of the biological focus on a specific temperature range. Life of this planet is dependent on keeping to amenable and keeping to temperatures that are amenable to life, including our own life. Strengthening precautionary approaches such as rebuilding overexploited or depleted fisheries. Overfishing is certainly an issue in this area as well. And responsiveness of existing fisheries management strategies reduce negative climate change impacts on fisheries with benefits for regional economies and livelihoods. Again, management of the resources in the context of ambitious climate change mitigation would work. But this is the present situation. And this concerns many of us. And I think it concerns every individual in the room, including ourselves during a certain part of our life. We are in this situation, we like to ignore what's coming and what's evolving. We need to overcome this inertia, not to go too fast. We need to overcome political paralysis that is so focused on the short term and the inaction in transformation. And this comes and brings us to feasibility, to the question of feasibility. What can we do? And actually, if you step back and look at it in a global and at a global level, what we can say is keeping warming to 1.5 is possible according to the laws of physics and chemistry, keeping in mind how the systems respond to CO2 and that this is anthropogenic, human-made. We have it. The future is in our hands. We can make the appropriate decisions. Do we have the technologies available to support mitigation and adaptation measures? Yes, we do. We may not have them at scale, and we may need new ones here and there, but the principles and how to approach this are there. These are opportunities also for businesses and investments. We would, however, need a redirection of financial flows. And this is a major hurdle at the moment. The European Union, for example, has set the target that we should phase out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. I'm wondering whether they are really getting there. So this is the direction of financial flows is certainly something very important for the banking sector. Where do investments go? institutions we have. We may develop them, need to develop them further to consider the long-term challenges. And the question is, with all these yeses, where is the bottleneck? And clearly the bottleneck is informed policy leading and directing societal transformation. So building of societal will and political will, and both of them together at the same time, that is where the current challenges are. And I'm happy to say that there is hope. Because if you see how the global society and community has responded to the 1.5 report and the societal mobilization that has happened, especially among the young generation, gives us hope that this mobilization will also push policy along. Because especially in democracies, policymakers like to respond to what the majority of the voters think. So this coordinated development of societal and policy will is important. And to conclude, there are these key messages to be kept in mind. For minimizing impacts and associated risks, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, each choice matters, and political and societal will matters. And with that, I can say, the more decisively and earlier we act, the more able we will be to address unavoidable changes, manage risks, improve our lives, and achieve sustainability for ecosystems and people around the world, today and in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Portner, thank you very much. A very clear and concise explanation of the benefits of mitigation, what we need to do to mitigate, and perhaps some of the blockers. And I think beautifully set this up for the Q&A, because you heard policy is lagging, societal drivers through the younger generations having some action. What about business? But we'll come to that in a moment. Before we do that, to talk about Hong Kong specifically in a warming world, I'd like to invite P.W. Chan from the Hong Kong Observatory to provide a presentation to us. Thank you, P.W.
Good morning. It's my honor for me to talk about the context of climate change in Hong Kong, and also we'll go through some of the major points about the adaptation measures taken by the government, the Hong Kong government, about the climate change. So, put in the context, and actually I think you are quite familiar with this, and about we are already seeing the effects of climate change in Hong Kong, and so we have more hot days, fewer cold days, and also the sea level rising, and also the more extreme rainfall. And actually, that's based on the observations. On the left-hand side is the number of the hot nights, which means the minimum temperature at the observatory headquarters is 28 degrees or above, and also the number of hot days with the maximum temperature at 33 degrees or above, and also the number of cold days. Cold here in Hong Kong means just 12 degrees. So you can see that there's a change of the whole pattern from in the previous years to the recent period. And then the number of hot nights is increasing, the number of hot days also increasing significantly, and the number of cold days decreases significantly. And on the right-hand side, there's the extreme rainfall as recorded at the Hong Kong Observatory headquarters. And then so the number of records to be broken, and about the maximum rainfall recorded here. And the recent one is in 2008. There's the hourly rainfall of more than 145 millimeters per hour. And also the rising sea level, and then in the long-term trend. So we're already seeing that happening in Hong Kong. Especially in the last couple of years, we saw the effects of the super typhoons, and then about the sea level rise, the return period is decreasing. So previously, based on the Typhoon Wanda in 1962 and also Hagapit in 2008, we are talking about the return period of 50 years. And with the occurrence in 2017, the Hato, and 2018, the Mangkhut, actually the return period of a high sea level is decreasing. And actually, as talked by our director, Mr. Shen, this morning, seeing the effect of global warming at the end of the century, maybe we are going to see the situation of Hato and Mancun every year. So it's really very alarming. So what's going to happen in the future, the climate projections? So this slide summarizes the major points about the very hot days, the heat stress days, the more extreme rainfall, and also the wet years versus the drought, the dry years. And then in the various RCP scenarios, the number of hot days and very hot days, and also the heat stress days are going to increase. So especially for RCP 8.5 at the end of the century, we are talking about more than 100 or 140, 160 number of days is going to have very hot days and nights. And rainfall, a little bit of variability, but in general, there's a trend. We are seeing more intense rainfall. And also, there's still the occurrence of dry years cannot be ruled out. As to the sea level, for the various RCP scenarios, the sea level is going to rise so that at the end of the century, we are talking about a further sea level rise of about one more meter. And this is consistent with the global scenarios, and also the sea level rise can be as a result of the storm surge, which is the major effect of the typhoons the coastal areas of southern China, including Hong Kong. And this is a very new result just released, and then they're talking about the typhoons or tropical cyclones in the western North Pacific. And so we have the frequency of the tropical cyclones is decreasing. And you can see from the from point A, the number of the tropical cyclone TC frequencies may be decreasing. But then the tropical cyclone intensity is going to increase, and also the proportion of very intense tropical cyclone also increases. At the same time, the precipitation associated with the tropical cyclone is also on an increasing trend. So that means we are going to have more intense tropical cyclones, especially the proportion of very intense tropical cyclones is going to increase together with an increase in the tropical cyclone associated precipitations. So the precipitation and also the storm surges associated with intense typhoon is going to affect us with the further rise of the sea level. So, in summary, the social impacts of the climate change. So, more heat-related illness due to the more extreme heat extremes. And also the higher consumption for electricity for cooling, which is going to increase further the carbon emissions. And also the increased risk of flooding and landslides as we see more and more intense rainfall situations, and also the precipitation associated with the tropical cyclones. And the threat of the storm surge with higher sea level together with stronger tropical cyclones, and also the more infrastructural damages due to the stronger tropical cyclones. So these points are to be borne in mind is going to happen in the future if the present trend of climate change is still keeping. So this kind of situation, as we can see from Super Typhoon Mancun, is going to happen. And also if we talk about the sea level rise as a result of these typhoons, in Mancun, it's talking about 3.88 meters in the Coral Bay, so about 4 meters. But if we're going to add 1 more meter to that because of the climate change at the end of the century, so what's going to happen? If the tide level in the Victoria Harbour, which is measured at the Coral Bay, is going to reach 5 meters, you can see from this all the areas in green and yellow, there's all the low-lying areas will be flooded. So the situation will be quite alarming. And so besides the storm surge effect, there's also the rainstorms and the high winds associated with the tropical cyclone is going to affect us. And so this kind of situation in the Mancun case, with the fallen trees, the breaking of the glass in the windows, it will be more frequent. And also in terms of the economic loss, recently we have a collaboration with the Hong Kong Federation of Insurers and also with the Hong Kong various government departments and the utility companies. And then we try to come up with the economic loss as a result of the recent 2 very intense typhoons, the Hato and the Mancun. So in Hato, Hong Kong is less affected. The economic loss is in the order of 1 billion. But for Mangkhut, because Hong Kong is affected by the stronger ring bands associated with the typhoon, the amount of economic loss is increasing in the order of 4 to 4.6 billion Hong Kong dollars. So this trend is different from the other places in the Greater Bay Area. For example, in Macau, the effect of hail is much more. So in the situation of Mangkhut, the amount is already becoming much less. And also for Guangdong in general, over the Greater Bay Area, and the amount of economic loss as a result of the typhoon is also decreasing. So for the case of Mangkhut, maybe because the strongest winds and also the strongest rain band is not affecting Macau and also the rest of Guangdong. And secondly, maybe action has to be taken in preparation of the effect of Mangkhut by making reference to the situation in Hato, so that more actions have been taken to reduce the effect of the typhoons. As a result, the amount of economic losses decreases. But then in general, we come up with those figures about the economic loss. So that we are going to review the similar situation for tropical cyclones in the future. So the economic loss figure will also be provided in collaboration with other organizations. So how to tackle climate change? So that's the adaptation, mitigation, and also the resilience. Mitigation, in Hong Kong, we are going to use more renewable energy, and that's the ways to energy potential, and also building more PV on the government buildings, and also in the small houses in new territories as well. So there's an incentive for them to install more solar panels, and then they can sell the extra electricity back to the power companies. And also energy saving, the implementation of district cooling system, and that's under consideration for the East Kowloon, and also the changing the behavior with the use of more power efficient electricity appliances, and also to change the habit of using, for example, air conditioning, lighting, things like that. That's about the mitigation. Adaptation, there are a number of aspects. So one is on the infrastructure, about the slope safety, about the flooding of from the sea, about the storage of the water underground during the in heavy rain situation. There's the city planning, the smart city development, and also the water security, and also the conservation of the biodiversity in Hong Kong. So for city planning, that's to reduce the effect of the urban heat island. And the Hong Kong government is incorporating urban climate and air ventilation considerations in the design of the new buildings in the urban areas. Slope safety, continue to do it, especially to make sure that to avoid these landslides, especially in heavy rain situation. With the blue-green infrastructure for water, natural water resources, and there's a demonstration project. I think one is going to happen in short term, and also the water security issues. And for coastal protection, CDD has commissioned a number of studies to review the climate change effect, and also the associated design or the impact on the design of the coastal infrastructures. And there are, in fact, a number of studies that the Hong Kong Observatory has been involved in the studies about the coastal hazards, about the impact on the critical infrastructures, and then that's the observatory providing the scientific input, and then the Works Department will review the worst case, for example, a super typhoon direct hit of Hong Kong, especially for the review of the case in Mangkhut. If you remember, Mangkhut actually is crossing the Luzon, and then there's a weakening of the intensity before it's going to affect Hong Kong. If we had just taken a more northern track over the Luzon Strait without further weakening, and then the effect on Hong Kong will be much more significant. So that will be included in the study about the coastal protection. For the resilience, the public education, the Hong Kong Observatory has been collaborating with the other government departments and also organizations in public education about climate change. There are various initiatives, and then there's the production of a couple of booklets about the climate change and biodiversity in Hong Kong, and also the education package about the climate change, and also we use our video channel over the internet, the Kumet stuff, which is broadcast every week, and then with the theme of climate change, and also in our annual open day as well. So, summary, Mitigation, propagation, public education, outreach activities, and adaptation, the climate projection, and also the information for the other stakeholders, and resilience. That's the forecast and continue the forecast and warning of the extreme weather, and also to raise the public awareness about the disaster protection. Thank you.
PW, thank you very much, and thank you very much also for what clearly is a lot of very detailed analysis that's being undertaken, slightly alarming. Some of the conclusions of that in terms of tidal surge impacts in Hong Kong, but also good to see the efforts going into both mitigation and adaptation. In our next part of the session, I'd like to invite our distinguished speakers from the IPCC to join a panel session, a Q&A session to include all of you, together again with Mr. Shun from the Hong Kong Observatory. If you perhaps come to take a seat at the high chairs. I think in this session, with everybody's permission, what I might try and do is perhaps to start with a little sort of recap, test whether my notes are any good on what we've heard this morning, but then quickly think about what this means for business. So that's what we'll get into in this stage. If you do have questions, please just put up your hand and the microphones will find you. Thank you. Great. So I'm going to start, this might be foolish, but going back to the first slide this morning to make sure I understood this. And Professor Jai, your slide was very clear. Human-induced climate change or human activity has caused the planetary temperature to go up by approximately 0.9 degrees. That's your conclusion from reading the research. I just want to play the skeptic for a moment. Sometimes we read that there might be other causes for climate change. In the thousands of research reports that I know you read, are there such other theories that are credible?
Actually, that's depend on time scale or the spatial scale. Say for one place, one small place like a region or like Hong Kong, a lot of factors influence the weather and the climate here, because there is you have energy, exchange from region by region. But globally, in my slide, mainly cause is one is from change of solar radiation, and another is from volcanic activity. And then from the Industrial Revolution, the emissions, and also we have land use. And that's all we call that external forces. And also inside the system, there is something like changing, like ocean warming, like El Nino, La Nina, also can change the weather and the climate, but in different time scale. Like El Nino, La Nina mainly based on year-to-year change.
Yes.
And for the solar radiation, you don't see much change throughout. Already included in my slide, you see the curve, the red one. Not much change throughout the the past century. I think less than 1%. I think of the change, very, very small change. But from when talk about, more than 10,000 years, the whole human history, or longer than that, that's another story.
Yes.
Because the change in the position of for the sun and the earth, then changing the radiation. But in the in the recent human history, main cause is human activity. We are very clear, but the time scale we talk about is decades to century scale.
Yes. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying there are other factors, but broadly over the timescales that we're looking at, they sort of net each other off, so that most of the 0.9 can be and is explained.
Yeah, we call that attributable to human activities.
Okay.
It's we can say it's likely or with a high confidence, because not only by we have observation, you see the change. We have model to prove that if you remove the human activity, you don't see such change. And you put on the human drivers, you see the increasing, as exactly as the warming, the trend we observed, and say much more information there, and also based on the theory, the process we understand.
That's very clear. Thank you. Now, the next question I was going to ask, you answered earlier, and somebody at the back answered what I think is a very good question. What happens if we go cold turkey on greenhouse gases today? So we go to 0 CO2, we go to 0 methane, and I think you answered that then we'd expect the temperature to rise a bit because of the lag, and we'd settle somewhere at 1.1 to 1.2 degrees. Although I was a little bit nervous because I think then Dr. Portner made a comment that in the next set of reports that there might be some acknowledgement that we may have slightly underestimated where these temperatures will go. But I'll leave that for the moment and sort of wanted to ask the other, or please, yes.
Yeah, I was referring to sea level rise going on as a long-term commitment, because the ice systems, the cryosphere is not in equilibrium with the temperatures, the changing temperatures.
I want to add, say the whole Earth system, they also have a lot of plants, trees, that can absorb 1/3 of annual emission from the human being. So that means if we stop emission, they can still take some from the system to reduce the accumulative emission a little bit.
Yes, okay. So follow-on question to that then is, thinking about what's happening to emissions today, and the bad news seems to be that they're not declining, and actually they're going up slightly. So if I take a optimistic assumption, and let's assume they're flat line, CO2 and methane, what does your assessment, what is the scientific opinion on then at what point or in how many years do we have before, under that scenario, we're then committed to 2 degrees or more?
Say which the level of, because we're talking about emission, we have two, one is we have annual emission.
Yes.
If we increase year by year.
Yes.
So if we can peak this, then add constant, the amount to the atmosphere. That's one account. Yes. Another one is cumulative.
Yes.
Emission. That's something balanced. That's something at net zero, we call that.
So I'm talking about annual emissions. So 40 gigatons per annum of CO2, and we flatline at that level. How many years is it before we've got 2 degrees C baked in?
For 2 degrees C?
Yes.
I would say, say for 1.5 degrees C is 2050, I think about 2070. About 2070 will be 2 degrees C,
Please.
It's already baked. In fact, I could add that if we base on the current commitment by the government to reduce the emissions, then it's highly likely that by the end of the century we will still see a 3-degree increase.
Yes.
That's based on the current.
Say, based on Paris Agreement, we have a national dedicated contribution.
Yeah.
So put them together. Say what we agreed. Then if follow what we promised, then we are heading for 3 degrees C at the end of 21st century.
Right.
Not far from the 1.5 degrees C target.
And where, if we look at measures of concentrations, would we be at that point? If we're at
408 parts per million CO2 today. Where is that 2 degrees C threshold if measured in greenhouse gas concentrations?
So even for 2 degrees C, say if we over, say something like Hans already talked, for 1.5 degrees C reach net zero 2050, and then for 2 degrees C 2070, past this, then you will over temperature over than 2 degrees C. If over that, then you have to take the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, then find another solution.
Right. My question was slightly different. Is there a concentration of CO2 that we can see as a sort of a threshold level to associate with 2 degrees C?
Oh, there is some, can convert to this.
Yeah.
Now it's about over 412, something like this.
And where does it have to get to? Where does that concentration get to such that we would then know, because to your earlier point, because the CO2 has a very long life in the atmosphere, that we are committed to 2 degrees C or beyond?
450.
I don't know exactly.
It's I mean, there's always an uncertainty range.
Yeah,
it's not a
450
close
is double,
calibration
something
curve,
like
right?
Double the emission compared with pre-industrial level. 450, no, 280 then.
Okay, and the reason I'm asking is because, and please do ask, because thinking to...
I mean, just to, I'm not really sure what you're getting at, but there is no added value by sort of speculating about a scenario where we keep emissions constant.
Yes.
Because the current economic dynamics and growth indicate that emissions will grow. We are seeing a decoupling of economic growth and emissions currently,
Yes.
but it's not sufficient to say we have reached the peak and now it can go down.
Yes.
Because that must be our concern. And even the current NDCs, the National Determined Contributions by countries, take emission reductions into account. And even then, with insufficient emission reductions below the current rate, we will reach 3 degrees by the end of century.
Yes.
With a range of uncertainty around it. And just to say, I mean, the currently, Pamao can certainly expand more on this, the current climate physics in the CMIP6 model generation, there are some models that consider that the climate, so-called climate sensitivity, the response of climate to carbon emissions, is underestimated and may be higher. So with the current emissions we may, or with the current CO2 levels, we may get stronger warming than we think.
Yes.
So there are uncertainties, right?
Of course. But the very clear message is a call to urgent action for the benefits and to
bring it down.
And to bring that down. Just if I may, to comments you made, Dr. Portner, about, and we'll come away from the severe scenarios and talk about hopefully where we might go. But you talked about a 4 degree C world and a great swathe of the sort of the central band of the planet becoming uninhabitable or unusable for cultivation. What might that mean, and does your assessment look at actually how many people might be displaced? How big is the sort of the migration if we were to unfortunately get to those extremes? Just to put some context to the outer.
Yeah, there are some projections there where according in relation to scenarios like the RCP 2.6, the 4.5, which takes us a little bit beyond 2, and the 6.5, and then 8.5. Say that the area where that is no longer amenable for human life without air condition will be expanding. And there are places on the planet that are concerned with this. This is the Persian Gulf area, which has high humidity closer to shore. It is the Amazon that is concerned. It is Southeast Asia that is involved. And so there are these places where we get conditions that are hostile to higher life. There is no animal life on land beyond 45 degrees body temperature. This is true for all animals. We find it difficult to live beyond 40 body temperature, and we are sick when this occurs. So there are And for plant life, the temperatures limits are a little bit higher, but which just emphasizes that for the complex life forms that have resulted during evolutionary history, these developments were possible because the planet had friendly temperatures for that.
Yes.
We cannot isolate us from the temperature regime of the planet.
No, thank you. That's very clear, because one of the things that is happening in the world of finance and investment is requests or looking at scenarios and looking at climate scenarios, temperature scenarios. What you're, and I don't want to over-interpret what you've said, Professor Morton, but it seems as though from what you're describing there, a 4 degrees C scenario is just so different from the world that we know today that perhaps it isn't even worth doing the economic modelling at that temperature, because we're going to see such big fundamental disruptions and through loss of ecosystem services. Is that a fair observation?
You will get a lot of strong warning signals, because if you let climate change go on unabated, in the end you pay much more money for the damages than you would pay now for moving into a strong climate mitigation.
Okay.
It's just not an option.
Yes.
It's not reasonable to take that into account.
No. And that's really what I was hoping to establish. That let's just accept it, put that one to one side, and focus where we need to be going. And Mr. Shun, you thinking of sort of some Hong Kong local impacts, and I think PW gave a very good presentation on these. But thinking of that sort of storm surge scenario in Hong Kong, is your estimate that I think we talked about you talked about Mangkhut becoming the every year scenario.
By the end of this century,
By the end of this century. So if Mangkhut is the every year, what then does the 1 in 100 years look like?
That's a good question.
How big is that, and what's the impact of that?
Now, first of all, if we look back, not to look further first, look back in our history, Hong Kong has been affected by a number of really severe typhoons, bringing very severe storm surge. In 2 cases, we had deaths of more than 10,000, 1937, 1906. And in 1874, there was one killing 8% of the population of Macau because of storm surge. Hong Kong, there was we haven't yet got new territories, so we had casualties, deaths of several thousand, all because of storm surge. So with this, then so it is totally feasible to have such historical storms repeating. For example, in the 1874 storm, we have reanalysis of the case based on historical data, storm surge modeling. We end up with the figure of 5 meters above the reference level chart data we call for the Victoria Harbour. This means that, as PW has shown, quite a number of low-lying areas in our central, surrounding the 2 sides of the Victoria Harbour will be flooded. So that's the baseline. Without climate change, without sea level rise. So if we talk about the sea level rise of the order of a meter, well, of course, this is assuming a high level of continuing the business as usual. By the end of the century, we have 1 meter increase, then we are talking about 6 meters, right? So that's even more flooding.
And what does even more mean? Does that Central is closed down, or we just lost certain
it really depends on our adaptation measures by the time. So if we do nothing, then probably we will see more than meters of floodwater above our Devos Road, Connaught Road. So you can imagine what scenario we will be getting at. And that has not yet been taken into account of the scenario of a real super typhoon landing over Hong Kong.
Right.
Making landfall, for example, slightly to our west, then it will be bearing the full brunt of the storm surge and the huge waves. And that's, in that scenario, coupled with sea level rise, probably we'll be expecting something like 7 meters in certain areas. So, as I understand, our infrastructural design is based on 7 meters in certain, for example, the power stations, the airport. Yeah, so we are getting close to the limit to seeing some major disruption under those scenarios. Of course, this is business as usual. If we do much more to contain the emission to 1.5 or 2 degrees, then we may not get as much. But still, because of the carbon dioxide emissions already committed a certain level of sea level rise, we will see 5 meters storm surge or even close to 6 in the future. That is already appearing in our history. So no reason to believe that it will not recur again.
Let me give you some more extreme reference points where you consider what the system and what the capacity of the global system is for change. All the ice that is available in glaciers and ice sheets on the planet, if you melt it all, and the capacity is there, if we use all fossil fuel, it has been modeled, then we would melt all ice. And we would get 65 meters of sea level rise. So we're still good for 65 meters. This is the extreme reference point.
Yes.
It's unrealistic with current policies, yes, but it gives you a feeling for how uncertain we are with respect to saying, oh, is there half a meter or 10 centimeter more? How certain we can be about what a certain degree of warming actually does to the cryosphere, especially since this is a long-term response. We do not know the tipping point when things will be accelerating, where it is, at which global temperature, whether it's 1.5 or 4 or 3, and so forth. So there are uncertainties. But all of this kind of thinking in the context of these extreme references, these have been in place during Earth's history. The last interglacial, 120,000 years ago, had 7 to 8 meters higher sea level than pre-industrial, at temperatures that we are having now. Okay, the position of the Earth was a little different, and polar and tropical temperatures were a little different, so it's not fully comparable. But then the last time the planet had 400 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere, 3 to 5 million years ago, it had 7+ meters higher sea level. So it's something we are headed for, and it's a warning signal which would encourage us to use a precautionary approach and not trigger the system more than we actually need to.
Yes. So let's try and bring that down to the businesses represented in the room. So what does that mean? And I'll come back to you again, Mr. Shum. We've talked about, we might just be okay at, or we're planning to be okay for that sort of, the next, wherever Mancook gets to going forward. But what about other impacts? And in the storms, things like wind speeds, because it seems wind does a lot of damage. Because we talked about storms becoming more intensive, even if the frequency doesn't necessarily go up. But how much more intensive are they getting, and when do we start to approach the design parameters of all of these wonderful single glazed, Robert, thank you, single glazed buildings like this one?
Yeah, indeed, we are a part of the study that the government is doing is exactly on this point. Actually, we received some questions from developers asking about whether the building code today is sufficient. The building code today on the wind is based on the recorded worst scenario in the past, i.e. the Typhoon Wanda in 1962 and also the 1937 typhoon. So those were the reference. But obviously, if we do get the super typhoon landing over Hong Kong, we need to I think, upgrade the building code. But that is being studied by consultants based on the experience from other countries, based on the climate model projections. So we will have the answers in about a year's time.
Right.
Of course, apart from the wind speed, we will have concern about the heavy rain because as you can just saw from the news about the typhoon in Japan, you can see record-breaking rainstorm nowadays are quite frequent. We talk about 900 millimeters in a day, which is not experienced before, and that's entirely feasible today. And we have a very good infrastructure. The government has done a lot of good work to divert the rainwater before the rainwater reach the central business areas. We also have a good drainage system. But in case of this kind of record-breaking rainstorm comes, then still we will expect quite a number of flooding and also landslide. For this landslide part, our colleagues in the geotechnical engineering office also doing a lot of work because for the work so far in the past decades, since the 1970s, we have done a great job in enhancing the slopes safety for the artificial slopes. For example, just look outside the window. But because of the heavier and heavier rainfall rates expected actually occurring and also expected in the climate change scenarios, the concern on the stability of the natural slope is also increasing. The natural slope being that those not having man-made slopes. So those could be a concern for the future. Right. So that's we also need to be aware that we have, for example, in 2008, we have a rainstorm, black rainstorm, really heavy rain over Lantau Island. There was a landslide with a fetch of 2 kilometers. From the start of the landslide to the end, we talk about 2 kilometers run.
That was in PW's photograph, I think.
Yeah. And so that's over Lantau. So if it is occurring over here, you can imagine. So that's a real concern, and our engineering departments are working on this to plan ahead.
Yes. So we've clearly got current impacts that are very significant. If we look ahead in those scenarios where we don't do anything, the extremes are almost so extreme they're not worth talking about. So it appears, Dr. Zhao, you've sort of done your job here in getting us to the point where we now know what's causing it, and in a sense, all we're left really doing is we're sort of modelling pathways, but really the only credible ones are the ones where we have very rapid emissions reductions. And it's almost like we don't need RCP 8.5 anymore because it's just a world that's not worth considering. Is that sort of where you've got to, Professor Jai, on the sort of the climate science and what's driving warmings?
So because the first figure I show is telling the main warming throughout the century is caused by the human activity, mainly because of the carbon dioxide emission.
Yes.
And the future pathway is more linked to the socio-economic development and the society, the whole society, how many people, what type of life we're going to have in the future. So in R6, in R5, we use a very theoretical, the term to express the emission pathway called RCP, which link to radiative forcing, because we call that radiative forcing, concentration pathway,
right,
which is linked to the emissions. And for AR6, we use as SSP. shared social economic pathway, more linked to the social, society and economic development. Say we do not take action, maybe say that maybe business as usual, then will be RCP 8.5. That means human activity add something like 8.5, the units of the heat, add to the climate system. Because you add more than the solar gave us, the energy. And if you limit to the lowest one in the AR5, something RCP 2.6, this is something add 2.6, the radiative forcing, the unit to the system, that you can reduce this. But now seem to us the track we are following is in between.
Yes.
So even not, but not obviously not the RCP 8.5, because human being is taking action. We have more renewable energy using, and more the technical improvement, save the energy consumption.
Yes.
A lot, and also have a lot of other activities. But say for RCP, even for RCP 2.6, which is more linked to the 2-degree warming, so still there is some distance. And not mentioned for 1.5 degrees C, that means something like RCP 1.9, which was not existed for AR5,
right.
will be appear in next assessment report.
That's even more aggressive.
Even more, yeah.
Yes.
Based on our report for 1.5 degrees C warming, say if you want to reach global warming 1.5, but by the end of this century, then you have to reduce the emission 45% by 2030. To think only more than 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years.
Yes.
Do you think what action we're going to take to reduce 45% globally?
Yes. I've got one small follow-on, then I'll come to you, Magnus. Just in those forcings, what's the relative contribution between CO2 and methane? Is there, because it's from the SR 1.5, because of the short half-life of methane in the atmosphere, it seems if we cut that back, we can actually generate some cooling impacts, whereas because of the long life of CO2, we can't. Is there as we start to come to then think about governance, is there something there we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think more knowledge is on carbon dioxide. For methane, now we start to work on this. In AR6, we are trying to working on, say, other non-CO2 forces. Because, as Hans said, the other non-CO2 climate drivers, we could also can bring the co-benefits such as, because when you use coal, at one side you release carbon dioxide, at the other side you release the black carbon or other aerosol, which is pollutants.
Cooling.
Yeah, cause the human, also influence our human health. So for other drivers, I think they also have some scenario, but not the understanding is less than compared with.
And methane, just for the avoidance of doubt, and I expect that most people know. I mean, that's really about our food supply. It's about livestock as well as fugitive methane from energy.
Compared with carbon dioxide, methane is short-lived climate force. Its lifetime is shorter than 10 years. So, but for carbon, say immediately if you take action, methane, then you can contribute very quickly, but not for carbon dioxide.
So go vegan. Yes, Jean. Oh, Magnus, sorry, did you want to ask Magnus first, and then we'll come to Jean?
If you don't mind, I would like to ask a question, but I need to phrase it in a way that it really is a question and not. It's a question and not a statement.
And to make it concise, Magnus.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
So, as you know, Jonathan, I've been a 60-meter guy. We need to model for 60 meters for a couple of years now. So nothing I heard today surprised me. In fact, it remains fairly modest what you're projecting. I think that although I'm now inured to this catastrophe that we're sailing into, it's the Titanic. It's the Titanic. The biggest single danger is despair. This is something that, at first sight, seems, what on earth can we do? You've said it yourself, 4 degrees, let's give up, no point. But I think what we need to do is and here's my question, when can the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank host another event, which is the upside? Because this has been seriously down, and for many people, people who are not aware of this stuff, and I think most of you already are, seriously, deeply, suicidally depressing, I would say. And I think part of the problem in Hong Kong today is that the kids know that we're sailing into an iceberg. So my question is, when can you do one that's all about the amazing engineering technology and the spirit of innovation, not only young people, but old scientists at MIT and Stanford and in Beijing? Let's hear the good news, because we're very near to the end of this session and there's no time for good news. So when's the next event, please?
Yes.
That's the question.
Well, Magnus, firstly, thank you for endorsing our events, and thank you for suggesting for future events. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we have here, and as Robert said very clearly in the earlier sessions, we have the scientists who are talking about where we are on climate change, what the impacts are. And we'll start to come to your next point, because I think that's where Professor Ortner was going in his talk about governance and policy and what we need to do. But Jean, perhaps before we move on to that, please ask your question.
Yeah, I just had a question. So we need everything and anything we can just try to reduce as much as possible. So therefore, I wanted to ask a question about water vapor. The role of water vapor in greenhouse gas warming, how it's included in the models. Okay. And the reason why I'm asking is, anything we can do, if even from a business angle, does it mean we should be taking water out of the air? Does that help with the whole situation as well? So just a question.
I can do it first. Water vapor is the largest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So if without water vapor, then the temperature on the Earth system, the surface will drop drop 18 degrees, something like that level. So water vapor is very important, natural greenhouse gases. But what we have is human, you released more and more to the atmosphere, they add 1 degree more. The water vapor in the model is naturally designed, because when you have a warmer climate, they have more evaporation. Then in the atmosphere, you have more water vapor. This, we call that a feedback. So that's internal, not external driver. So that's already included in the whole system.
Yes. Does that answer your question, Jean? Deborah, I think we might be having another question on water coming up, perhaps?
Yes and no. One for Mr. Sun. Just want to clarify, when you were talking about the 5 meter and the possible 7 meter sea level rise from storm surge from Hato. You said it's from the chart datum, so that doesn't include tide, right?
Yeah, chart datum, yes.
Okay, so probably another 2.5 meters on top of that if it was high tide, if it arrived at high tide. Am I roughly?
No, including the tide.
Yeah. What would the number be?
Of course, the effect of the storm surge on a specific case will depend on the timing. So if it happens to be low tide, then we are safe. Yeah.
And high tide, it's probably about another 2 meters to the low tide. What is the Hong Kong band?
The high tide could get up to, well, normally 2.5, in certain cases 2.6, 2.7.
I have another. Thank you. And I have another question that's not related to water for the gentleman over there, the 2 professors. We talked about Paris Agreement, and you also talked about transport and international shipping and so on. We all know that international shipping as well as aviation is not in there. So how does the growth or not pledges related to that at the moment affect the projections?
I think this is not a... I don't think it's included for our scenario, for the pathways. but it's I think mainly for the impact, because in the future, when you have the more melting in the Arctic sea ice, then you have more opportunity maybe for shipping and transportation. But for international shipping, for the emissions, they're not much included, I think.
But the point being, they're not included in the Paris Agreement, but these emissions, total emissions, are included in your modelling of future temperature warmings. Yes,
they are in the global assessment, definitely, and certainly decarbonizing those sectors is important, needs to be done, and is a major industrial challenge. And the way this is going, that's maybe it's seen to different levels in different regions. For my own country, I can say there's a push and there's research going into the direction of synthetic fuels. So having excess renewable energy available to hydrolyze water, take the hydrogen, and then convert CO2, reuse the CO2 and convert it into hydrocarbons of different lengths would provide the fuel for aviation and for shipping. And it's again a matter of dimension. The technology is there, it's very costly, and it's very energy demanding. So it needs the kind of transformation in the energy system to bring us into a better future. But it is a perspective which I think personally is positive, and if we are really pushing there, that would be good. Actually, I have a question now. After all that you've heard from us, how is the banking sector positioning itself?
Yeah, that was my third question, but thank you for asking.
Well, I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative because there's one more question to come from the audience. But maybe let's take these two questions from the audience, and I'm very happy to share my perspective on what a bank would do at the end, and I would do that willingly in front of, for example, our regulators who are in the room, who also have a very keen interest in what a bank's doing in terms of both mitigating the risks they face and also playing their part in the societal challenge. But I don't want you to have to listen to me. I'd rather have the other two questions, and anyone who wants to talk to me can do that afterwards. So, question here and a question from David over there. David, you go, as you've got the microphone, possession being 9/10, you go first.
Well, putting aside, is this working?
We can.
Putting aside what Hong Kong might or might not be doing in terms of technical mitigation about things like rising sea levels or storm surges, it does seem to me that in the not too distant future we're going to have to face the fact that global governments are going to have to make some quite draconian decisions that are going to impact on lifestyle. Lifestyles that the majority of developed countries have got very used to over the last 50 years. I think somebody mentioned beef cattle. We know the problems there. Hong Kong, in fact, consumes more beef per head of population than any other place in the world. It's often said in Hong Kong that business couldn't function unless people were able to go in and out through the airport every day. So the amount of flights is just staggering. So the obvious question is, are we able to really combat the public mood, the public aspirations that are going to prevail, I think, unless there really are some very strong global decisions.
Peter, I think that's a great question. That does come to Professor Portner's comments on governance and blockers. But perhaps before we take that, David, let's have a final question from you.
Yeah. Assuming all these mitigating measures of reducing gas emissions fail, okay, and the average temperature goes up by 3 or even 4 degrees, and then we know that there will be disasters. A lot of people might be dying. That will reduce the population and human activities. Okay?
Yeah.
So just an assumption that we cannot control the temperature. As a result, the human activities will be reduced, and carbon dioxide emission will also be reduced. So my question is, based on the current theories and modeling, will the Earth restore itself to the temperature, pre-industrial temperatures, or will we be reaching a point of no return? That's basically my question.
Sorry, I don't think there is such scenario in the modeling. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Certainly the biosphere has the capacity to survive. It may not include us, but it would include other less complex species that are tolerant to more extreme environmental conditions. If you think of the evolutionary history of the planet, it's a close interaction between the biosphere and the physics and the atmosphere and how it has evolved. I mean, the composition of the atmosphere has been generated by life on the planet, by life forms on the planet. And the sustainability of life on the planet depends on the presence of the oceans, depends on the ocean currents and the living conditions that we enjoy in the different regions of the planet represent the last 8,000 years of Earth's history, which were able to maintain suitable living conditions and stable climates. Now, we are taking the risk to disturb that balance. And whether this balance, whether planet Earth will be able to sort of come back to that balance in the end after we have left the surface of the Earth with our activities, that is a good question to ask. Probably it will be a somewhat different world, but there will be still some biosphere remaining.
There'll be a conference of cockroaches discussing in 300 years' time. We're over time, so but maybe you could conclude just on those. You started to ask me the question on blockers, and if you want to turn that back to me, that's fine. But obviously, you're suggesting policymakers, you're making the case, you're pressing the urgency, you're providing them ideas. That all comes out in all of your reports. But there seem to be blocks. And do you think perhaps you should be turning the question and the appeal to the business sector and the sort of people who are present in this room? Could this be a more effective group to actually address some of these issues?
I must say there are a diversity of responses that are emerging also from the business sector. Sometimes interactions I've been in tell me that some business people are keen to get moving on something and do something. But what they need to wait for is that their governance sets the right set of conditions and framings for business to allow them to be competitive under these new conditions. Germany has just passed the so-called climate package, which in a climate law. Some people say it's a minuscule package, but it has some elements in it that actually can be strengthened. One element is a carbon price, where per ton of CO2 there will be a cost that will be imposed, and they're starting with 10 euros per ton, which is virtually ineffective. Economists recommend to start with something like 50 or 60 euros per ton of CO2, and this will be the kind of overarching impact on the economic system that we need to direct investments, financial flows, and so forth. And also there should be a removal of subsidies from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels need to be competitive in their own right in the system. So these overarching framing that needs to come, the incentives needs to come from economic policy. But the policymakers need to be courageous to implement that. And they are, at the moment, it seems they are skittish to implement anything like that because they are concerned that there may be so many forces in society that are pushing back on any constraints. Certainly a CO2 price with societal compensation is the strongest model that is currently under discussion.
But isn't there if we need the policy to drive the change and we're not getting the policy, so we're not getting the change, are you just painting the picture that David was painting of the 4-degree C world? Because the question I would ask, and again, very conscious of time, to everybody in the room, in the business world is, do we need government policy before we start to think about whether my physical asset in location X is actually going to become unusable and therefore suffer a substantial diminution in value? Do we need a government policy to tell us that consumers, they don't want to buy goods that have got high carbon embedded in them, and therefore to think, well, I need to change my business model if I want to keep selling products? Do we need governments? Does anybody would like to?
Can I maybe give you just as a start?
Yeah.
I think what clearly the research has shown that has been done, we do not need just a response. We need enough of a response. We need to reach the scale of what is needed.
Yes.
So these emission pathways that take us to 1.5, or at least to significantly below 2 degrees, need to be understood as hard guardrails. Yeah. And that is something that is difficult to get into the brain of some people. So everybody needs to join forces. Yes, business can do their own thing, clearly, but the question is whether it's enough. Yeah. And it seems, based on what we see in Western societies at least, it's not enough. And so the governance framing is a precondition for things to happen fast enough.
Well, I think that's a very good place to conclude the formalities. Whatever we're doing, it's not enough. So there's a challenge for us to leave the room and try and do some more, because it seems if we don't, the consequences are pretty clear. There doesn't seem to be any debate left around that. So on that thought, hopefully not too pessimistic, Magnus, but a call to action, and there are solutions. We haven't focused on those today, you're right, but I think we've heard quite a few areas, and we know amongst us that there are some areas, but we'll pause there. We have the room for a few more minutes, so please do stay for a few more minutes and to have a conversation if you'd like to. But if you agree with me that we've had, through the whole of this morning, not just in this session, an absolutely extraordinarily unique opportunity to hear from, talk to, ask our questions to the people who know more about the science that is undoubtedly driving the climate challenge, and you'd like with me to show your appreciation to all of these gentlemen, please do join me. Thank you.